It's past 10 p.m. The air is crisp but not cold, one of those early spring nights in Idaho where the wind moves just enough to make the silence feel heavier. A nearly empty parking lot sits under flickering streetlights, rows of parked cars casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. It should be quiet here. It should be peaceful. But tonight, it's anything but. A man lies motionless, blood pooling beneath him, seeping into the cracks of the pavement. His name is Emmett Corrigan, an attorney, a husband, a father of 5. Just hours ago, he was living his life like any other day, but now his story has ended. Nearby, another man clutches a gun. Blood drips from a wound of his own. He says he fired in self-defense, that he had no choice. But was that the truth? Or was this something else? Something darker? Something that had been building for months? A slow-burning fuse that finally ignited on this very night? To understand what really happened that night, we need to go back to a marriage that seemed perfect until it wasn't. To a man who had everything, yet still wanted more. To a secret affair that spiraled out of control, and to a jealous husband who refused to be forgotten. This is the story of love, betrayal, and a fatal confrontation. Before he was lying lifeless in a parking lot, Emmett Corrigan was the man standing in front of a courtroom, commanding attention. He was young, sharp, ambitious, the kind of attorney who could turn a case around with just his words. In Meridian, Idaho, he was seen as a rising legal star, a man with a bright future ahead of him, the kind of future that made others envious. At just 30 years old, Emmett had already built his own law firm, defending those who found themselves on the wrong side of the law. Criminal defense. It wasn't easy, but for Emmett, it was exhilarating. Every case was a challenge. Every client was a puzzle to solve. And every win, another stepping stone towards something bigger. But Emmett wasn't just a hotshot attorney. He was a family man. At least, that's what the world saw. A devoted husband to Ashley Corrigan, a woman he had met in college. Together, they had built what many would call the perfect life. A beautiful home, 5 children, and a marriage that looks solid from the outside. But perfection is often an illusion, and behind closed doors, even the strongest foundations can begin to crack. For Emmett, work became an escape. The late nights, the endless hours spent at the office, the adrenaline rush of the courtroom, it all fed his ambition. But at home, things were changing. His time was stretched thin. The stress of managing both a growing law firm and a house full of children started to take its toll. Ashley felt it. The distance, the way he looked at his phone a little too often, the way his mind always seemed somewhere else. She asked the questions any wife would ask. And Emmett? He had all the right answers. But a woman's intuition is hard to silence. And Ashley wasn't wrong to worry. Her name was Kandi Hall. A woman with her own life, her own marriage, her own secrets. She wasn't just some stranger. She was his new office assistant. A motherly figure, a friendly face at work, a listening ear. Someone who understood the stress he was under. It started with small conversations, shared complaints about long hours, laughs over coffee. Then the meetings became more personal, the texts more frequent, and soon it wasn't just work keeping Emmett at the office late at night. Kandi was married too, but that didn't seem to matter. Not to Emmett, and not to her. Lines blurred, boundaries disappeared, and before either of them knew it, they had crossed into dangerous territory. At first it was thrilling. The stolen moments. The late-night rendezvous. The rush of something forbidden. But affairs, they never stay secret forever. And in this case, when the truth came out, it would end in blood. Because Kandi wasn't just Emmett's mistress, she was another man's wife. And that man? He wasn't about to be cast aside. And when Robert Hall found out, There was no turning back. This is where everything changes. If you're captivated by true crime stories and want to stay updated on the darkest cases, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We release in-depth crime documentaries just like this one, uncovering the chilling details behind real-life mysteries. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button now. For Kandi Hall, marriage was supposed to be forever. She had done everything right, or at least, that's what she told herself. She married young, settled down, had 2 teenage children. Her husband, Robert Hall, was a former sheriff's deputy, a man who believed in rules, in structure, in loyalty. But what happens when a marriage becomes more about duty than love? Kandi and Robert had been together for years, but things between them, they weren't easy. Their marriage was rocky, full of tension that never seemed to settle. And over time, Kandi felt it, the distance growing, the conversations getting shorter, the love that had once been effortless now feeling like a burden. Then there was Emmett. What started as harmless conversation at the office quickly became something more. Emmett was charming, confident. He made her feel seen, wanted. And Kandi, she liked that feeling. Maybe it had been missing for years. Maybe it was never there to begin with. Either way, she wasn't ready to give it up. At first, it was just talking, innocent in theory, late-night texts about work that slowly turned personal, a coffee break that stretched a little longer than it should have, a lingering touch that neither of them pulled away from. And then, the moment came when they stopped pretending it was just friendship. For Kandi, it was an escape, a way to feel alive again. For Emmett, maybe it was lust. Maybe it was more. Either way, neither of them stopped. And the secrecy, the risk, that only made it more intoxicating. But affairs, they don't stay secret forever. And with every stolen moment, every whispered promise, they were playing with fire. Because while Kandi may have been running from her marriage, Robert Hall, he wasn't the kind of man to be left behind. Robert and Kandi Hall's marriage hadn't been perfect for a long time. It wasn't just Kandi keeping secrets. It had started with Robert. Years before Kandi ever met Emmett Corrigan, it was Robert who had strayed first. He had his own affairs, his own moments of deception. And Kandi? She had forgiven him. Or at least, she tried. But when trust is broken, it never truly heals. The cracks stay, waiting for something, or someone, to wedge them open again. And this time, that someone was Emmett Corrigan. Robert had been the one who betrayed first, but when he realized his wife had done the same, it wasn't so easy to forgive. Robert Hall had spent years serving the law. He believed in right and wrong, in truth and consequences. But there's one thing they don't teach you in law enforcement: how to handle the moment you realize your own life is falling apart. Maybe Robert had felt it for a while. The shift in Kandi's mood, the late-night phone calls she tried to hide, the way she suddenly seemed happier, but not because of him. It started small, the way she guarded her phone, the whispers behind closed doors, the longer hours at work that didn't quite add up. But in a marriage, you tell yourself stories, convince yourself that you're imagining things, that your mind is playing tricks on you, because the alternative is too painful to face. But suspicion, it grows, it festers, and once it takes root, it's only a matter of time before you start looking for the proof. And then he found it. The truth wasn't hidden anymore. It was staring him in the face. Kandi wasn't just distracted. She wasn't just unhappy. She was having an affair, and not just with anyone, but with a man Robert had never even suspected. Heartbreak is one thing, betrayal is another. In that moment, something inside Robert Hall shifted. He was no longer the lawman, no longer the reasonable husband trying to fix his marriage. He was a man who had been cast aside, a man who had been made a fool. And the thing about men like Robert, they don't take betrayal lightly. When he received that call that night, That's when Robert made a choice. This wasn't going to slide, not this time. Robert Hall wasn't just going to watch his wife slip away. No, he was going to stop this, one way or another. March 11, 2011, a night that started with words and ended in blood. It began inside a home filled with the kind of tension that had been building for months. Emmett Corrigan, the rising attorney, the husband, the father of 5, stood face to face with his wife Ashley. Their marriage had been strained for weeks, but that night, it all came to a head. Ashley didn't recognize the man standing in front of her. Not like this, not full of rage, resentment, something else she couldn't quite name. And yet, she held his face in her hands, begging for him to open up. And just like that, he was gone. Just a few miles away, Kandi Hall and her husband, Robert, sat together, talking about the possibility of saving their marriage. Robert had known about the affair for months. He had lived with it, swallowed the betrayal. But for some reason, he was still trying to fix something that had already shattered. Then, in the middle of it all, Kandi got up and said 5 simple words that would change everything. "I'm going to Walgreens." Under the glow of the Walgreens sign, Kandi and Emmett found each other once again. They had done this before. Stolen moments, late-night meetings. But something about tonight felt different, urgent, maybe even reckless. Kandi left her car behind and climbed into Emmett's truck. They drove to a secluded spot, away from the lights, away from prying eyes, away from everything that tied them to their real lives. And this was supposed to be their escape. But even here, they weren't alone, because back at Walgreens, someone else had been watching. Kandi's daughter had seen her mother's car parked at Walgreens, and unsuspectingly, she told her father, Robert Hall. Walgreens security footage would later show Robert Hall arriving, walking into the store, scanning the aisles, searching for his wife. But she wasn't there. Robert returned to his truck, his hands gripping the wheel too tight. Inside, he called Kandi, asked her outright, and she didn't lie. "I'm with Emmett," she said, and that was it. That was the moment everything broke. Emmett took the phone from Kandi, taunted him, a man who had taken everything from Robert and wasn't the least bit sorry about it. "Stay right there," he said. "We'll be right there." Robert Hall had already made up his mind. Emmett should have walked away. Kandi should have stopped him. But instead, they drove back to Walgreens, back to the place where this all began. And there, just outside the range of the security cameras, the 2 men finally came face to face. The moment was electric. Anger, betrayal, 2 men who had everything to lose. And then it happened. Kandi would later say Emmett started it, that he was the first to shove Robert, that she turned away for just a second, telling them both to go back to their trucks. And that's when she heard it. When Kandi turned around, her husband was covered in blood. Emmett lay on the ground, motionless. 1 bullet to the head, 1 to the heart. She ran to him, held his face, kissed him, but it was too late. By the time police arrived, a man lay dead in a Walgreens parking lot. Another, covered in blood, claimed self-defense. But the question that would determine Robert Hall's fate wasn't just about what happened that night. It was about why it happened. Had he planned this all along? The night of the shooting, police found 2 men on the ground, 1 dead, the other wounded but very much alive. Robert Hall had been shot in the head, but it wasn't fatal. He survived, and by the time he arrived at the hospital, he already had his story ready. Robert told police Emmett had been the aggressor, that it wasn't murder, it was self-defense, that he had no choice. But the crime scene told a different story. Emmett was unarmed. Robert was the only one who fired a gun that night, and the 2 bullets that killed Emmett, 1 in the heart, 1 in the head. Not the kind of shots you take by accident. Robert Hall was arrested for second-degree murder, but the trial would decide if it was a crime of passion or a calculated act of revenge. The prosecution painted a very different version of events. Robert didn't walk into that parking lot afraid for his life. He walked in angry, jealous, ready to settle a score. This wasn't a sudden heat-of-the-moment reaction. This was a man who had been stewing in his own rage for months, and when he finally had his chance, he took it. And they had proof. Surveillance footage showed Robert stalking through Walgreens just minutes before the shooting, searching for his wife, not afraid, not hesitant, but determined. And then, the phone call. The moment Emmett taunted him. Robert Hall heard exactly where they were. He chose to go. And when he got there, he chose to pull the trigger. Only Robert's hand had gunpowder residue in it. The defense had one argument. Robert was acting in self-defense. He wasn't the aggressor. Emmett was. According to Robert's version of events, Emmett had shoved him first. The fight turned physical. He feared for his life. But was that really true? Or was it just the only way out of a guilty verdict? The jury wasn't just weighing the facts. They were weighing who they believed more. And that's where the testimonies came in. Kandi Hall took the stand, and her version of the story, it didn't do Robert any favors. She claimed Emmett pushed first, but she never saw him throw a punch. She never saw him threaten Robert's life. But she did see what happened afterward, Robert standing over a dying man. Some saw her as a victim, a woman who had been caught between two men who let their pride destroy them. Others, they saw her as the catalyst. If Kandi Hall had never started this affair, would any of this have happened? Then there was Ashley Corrigan, Emmett's wife, a woman who had already lost everything. And in that courtroom, she had to sit feet away from the man who pulled the trigger. She spoke of Emmett's flaws, his temper, their fights. But she also spoke of his love for their children, the way he wanted to be better. And then she looked at Robert, the man who had taken him away, and she made it clear this wasn't self-defense. This was murder. The jury deliberated for hours. When they returned, the air in the room was thick, suffocating. Robert Hall's fate rested on just a few words, but not of murder. The jury rejected second-degree murder. Instead, Robert Hall was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. The difference? Intent. They believed he acted in rage, that he snapped, that he didn't plan to kill Emmett, but in the moment he wanted him dead. Robert Hall was sentenced to up to 30 years in prison. And just like that, one life was lost, another was destroyed, and two families were left picking up the pieces. A trial ends, a verdict is given, a sentence is handed down. But for the people left behind, there is no closure, no final gavel strike that makes the pain disappear, just time. And time does not erase the past. For Ashley Corrigan, the end of the trial didn't mean the end of her grief. It meant waking up every morning without her husband. It meant raising 5 children alone, answering their questions, helping them understand a world where their father was gone forever. And rebuild she did. Years later, Ashley found love again. She remarried, started over, built a new life. But she didn't just move forward, she turned her pain into purpose. Today, she's a successful author, writing about faith, resilience, and the power of healing. Her story didn't end in that courtroom. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. And then there was Kandi Hall, the woman caught between two men, the woman whose choices set everything in motion. The woman who, in the end, lost them both. Did she regret it? Did she ever love Emmett? Or was he just an escape, a man who made her feel something she hadn't felt in years, maybe even something she had never felt at all? Was it real? Or was it just destruction disguised as love? And then there was Robert Hall, a man who had already cheated on his wife, but when she did the same, he couldn't take it. A man who let his jealousy consume him, who followed them, who brought a gun, who could have walked away, but didn't. Was he a cold-blooded killer, or just a man who snapped? In Robert's mind, he had already lost everything, and in that moment, when he pulled the trigger, he wasn't thinking about prison, about his future, about right or wrong. He was thinking about revenge, about power, about finally taking back control. Robert Hall got 30 years. Some say it wasn't enough. Others say it was too much. Because what was this really? A calculated execution? Or just a man who let his emotions take over? For Ashley Corrigan, justice will never mean getting Emmett back. For Kandi Hall, justice might just be living with the choices she made. And for Robert Hall, justice came in the form of a prison cell, a life behind bars, and a single night that defined him forever. At the end of it all, who do you think was really to blame? Was this the result of one person's actions or a series of decisions stacking like dominoes until they finally collapsed? Let me know what you think in the comments. And this isn't the only time passion has turned to bloodshed, because next time we'll dive into another case, another story where love, betrayal, and violence collide, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until then, stay safe, because sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we should fear the most. And if you're fascinated by true crime, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon to never miss an upload. We have more gripping stories coming soon, shedding light on cases that deserve to be told. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next one.